Dave, neuroscientists, some of which are good friends of yours and mine, would look to the neural correlates of consciousness as the mechanisms that we can study now quite well that will probably lead to a complete understanding of consciousness at some point within the material world. As you look at consciousness, how do you see the brain becoming conscious?
I think we need to distinguish between the project of finding neural correlates of consciousness, states of the brain that are active, when you're conscious in a certain way, and neural explanations of consciousness. So right now, the science is developing really very fast and in exciting ways, narrowing down the neural correlates. We find out that certain cells in your inferior temporal cortex are firing when you're conscious of certain images visually, and we might eventually be able to find a massive covariation between the two, but nothing there yet is providing anything like an explanation of why we're conscious. Rather, what this science does is just assumes the fact of consciousness and, observes its variation and correlates this with variations of states of the brain. So nothing about this tells us why consciousness should even exist in the first place.
Well, we're beginning to see some very sophisticated things. We see cells that react if my hand is this way and don't react if it's this way, and cells that will react if it's one color or another color, mirror neurons that will look like I'm doing something when I watch somebody else doing something. So very sophisticated, differentiated neurons are so clearly correlated. How could you, it seems irrational to have so detailed correlation and one not being the cause of the other.
Well, all this is correlation, and it's wonderful correlation. Wonderful science is coming out of this. Maybe one is the cause of the other. Maybe the brain is the cause of consciousness, but cause and effect are different things. My hand hits my other hand. One thing caused the other thing. They're two different things. If my brain causes my consciousness, then consciousness is something distinct from the brain. The materialist view, the reductionist view, is that all there is to consciousness is the brain. That requires something much stronger than correlation. That requires sort of identification, saying there's just one thing here, not two. But this study of correlations, it's always correlation between two different, separately observed things. We observe the brain and we observe our state of consciousness. So everything we've seen so far is completely consistent with there being two different things here. And we haven't yet got anything like the kind of explanation that would unify them into one phenomenon.
Are you not just placing your need for definition in a way to make it impossible for neuronal correlates to be, in fact, such consciousness?
I'm just looking for what we get out of all of our best scientific theories, which is explanation and understanding. Nothing right now that we've got out of brain science tells us why consciousness should exist in the first place. All the brain science we have, it seems to be completely consistent with the absence of consciousness. Now, someone adds in some correlations. When you have a neuron like this, you get consciousness like this. That's great, but that's sort of an add-on extra to the theory. It doesn't tell us why there is consciousness. It assumes consciousness and theorizes about it.
Maybe there's no reason. Maybe consciousness emerged as some add-on phenomena at some point that got selected for in the process, and to require it to understand it, to say why it happened, is the same thing to ask is why aren't the planetary cycles perfectly round?
Well, there are some things in science that we don't have to explain. Those are the fundamental laws. We explain the planet's orbits in terms of certain underlying principles of gravity and mechanics and who knows what. So now we understand why the planetary orbits are elliptical. Now, at a certain point, though, you get down to the basic laws of motion, the basic laws of quantum mechanics. And at a certain point, you say, why does the law of gravity hold? Why is the fundamental theory true? And at a certain point, explanation stops. Those things have to be taken as a brute. If that's what we have to do for consciousness, if we have to take this fact that brain processes and consciousness go together as a brute fact in the same way, then all I say is we should take the same attitude towards it as we take in physics. We should acknowledge that as a fundamental law, not to be further explained. And that's actually the view on which my bets are going right now. There are fundamental principles connecting brain processes and consciousness.
Well, maybe that's just a definition that you're bringing to consciousness, and that brute fact of consciousness is just putting a definition on something that really has no extrinsic meaning other than it is the representation of all these billions, 100 billion neurons and trillions of different combinations expressing these extremely complex patterns.
Well, consciousness is real. I mean, it has a really definite character. Right now, I'm looking at you, I'm listening to you, and it's got absolutely definite conscious character that's totally different from the character, say, of my conscious experience when I close my eyes, or the conscious experience of being a child or being a bat. There are these real differences in consciousness, and that's what we want to explain. So I don't think you can just explain them away and saying this is just a representation. It's a real phenomenon. Then the question is, why should it exist? How can we know about all of its properties? What is it like to be a bat? You know, we could study all of the brain processes of a bat and figure out what the bat is doing when it does sonar and so on. Is that going to tell us about the bat's conscious experience? What it's like to be the bat? There seems to be a further question here about consciousness within the bat that all that brain science isn't going to tell us. That's what we're interested in here.
Let's take another kind of experiment, and that are the split brain experiments, where for medical reasons, because of epilepsy or tumors, we have to do a severing of the communication between the two hemispheres. And in those situations, we find bizarre occurrences where, in fact, there are dual consciousness in one's head, so much so that when one side is active, it doesn't think the other side of the body is even part of it. Mm-hmm. So you have this very bizarre change in consciousness, or multiple personalities, but so directly determined by a physical intervention.
Yeah, it's completely unquestionable that there's a very intimate relationship between the brain and consciousness. So you affect my brain, you give me a drink, you give me drugs, you punch me in the head, you affect my consciousness. And the split brain is just a very nice example of that. You know, you sever the corpus callosum between the hemispheres, you affect the consciousness radically. So any respectable theory of consciousness has got to acknowledge this connection. There are fundamental principles, connections between the brain and consciousness. But this is still compatible with two very different theories. One, a purely reductionist theory, where consciousness is wholly explained in terms of the brain. Then we say there's nothing else to say. And second, what we might call a dualist or a non-reductionist theory, where we say there are two things here. There's consciousness and the brain, and what science is doing is studying the laws that connect the two. So I think that what we get out of all these experiments is a better and better understanding of the laws that connect consciousness with the underlying processes in the physical brain. But nothing about this shows that that's all that consciousness is.
So do you think it's in principle possible, however far we go forward, for anything in neuroscience to be able to break through the kinds of explanations that you would require to explain how you define consciousness in terms of brain science? Is that possible in principle?
I mean, never say never. Maybe all of us have been screwing up all along, and some amazing genius will come along who's had an idea none of us have ever thought of. So we have to allow something like that possibility. But all I can say is, right now, you know, what neuroscience is giving us, and what neuroscience gives us by its character, is objective science, explanation of objective mechanisms that perform objective functions. And there's principled reasons, not just like, hey, right now we don't know, but there's principled reasons to believe that merely explaining the objective mechanisms that perform objective functions, that will always leave a gap to consciousness. Why should any of that stuff be accompanied by subjective experience? You can know about all that without knowing what it's like to see red, what it's like to fall in love. That's a principled gap. It's not just a matter of how much neuroscience we know now. Now, could there be an utterly amazing scientific or philosophical revolution that so far none of us can yet contemplate? Sure, I can't rule it out, but we've just got to do the best we can for now.
Let me tell you something that fascinates me, and that is there is an increasing number of theologians who are deeply committed Christians, who really believe in the Bible and God and future resurrection and afterlife, you know, the whole smorgasbord. And yet these people now have become what they call non-reduction physicalists. that they are no longer dualists. So they believe in this theology and are monist in believing that only the brain is real. Now, they believe in a resurrection and so I won't bother with that at some point. But in terms of they are not dualists anymore. But you, who are not a theist, are still a dualist. Isn't that an odd kind of twisting of the world of ideas?
I don't know very much about theology. I'm just a simple country boy, a scientist, believes in what he has to believe in, and there's reason to believe in consciousness. Now, if you ask me, I look at this theology, and there was a guy who was kicked out of the church, right, for saying, I believe in God, and here's what God is. He's just this process in the natural world. And someone said, no, you don't believe in God. They kicked him out. So I'm inclined to think this is natural. This is atheism under another name, but this is just my naive view of these matters. Likewise, someone might say, well, I believe in consciousness, but it's just all this objective functioning. And that's all there is to consciousness. It's just a form of behavior. I say that's not really believing in consciousness. If you want to get consciousness into the picture, the real subjective experience, and you acknowledge that as real, then we need a scientific theory of it. And I think no purely objective theory of consciousness is going to give it. No purely objective theory of the brain is going to get us to consciousness. So just scientific principles, scientific method leads us to acknowledge it as a further entity.